about what is the purpose of feedback and grading. That's the question that we've asked ourselves, and we've had to kind of dig into that a little bit as educators and as a school district. A couple references. The slides that I'm using are coming, most of them are coming from Thomas Guskey's presentation that he gives all over the country. He's a standards-based grading expert and has done a lot of the research around why this is a good system for providing feedback to students. Also, Leanne Young is one of his research partners there, so wanted to make sure we give them credit for some of these slides that we're going to be showing. So these are, according to Guskey, there are 6 purposes of grading that teachers have identified. When you ask teachers and educators across the country, these are the things that they say are their purposes for grading. One would be communicating achievement status to parents. Also, to provide information to students for self-evaluation. To select, identify, or group students for instruction. So sometimes it's, that's how grading has been used to determine where kids go, what classes they should be put into. It's kind of a sort and select type of procedure. To provide incentives for students, so using grading as kind of a motivator. To evaluate the effectiveness of instructional programs, to look back at data and say how have students done in this class or in this program, and to evaluate that. And to document students' effort or responsibility. So there's a lot of different purposes that educators identify, again, across the country for grading. Parents generally are a little more consistent in what they think the purpose for grading is, and really are interested in how is my child doing, and is he or she learning, and wanting to be able to see that in a way that's easy to understand, quick to analyze, and really know what you're looking at in terms of what that feedback means. So what makes it standards-based, okay? So you've probably seen this proficiency scale. This is the scale that we use in Poudre School District. And part of what makes it standards-based is that you have a scale like this. Now there's other scales around the country that are similar, might have more categories, might have less categories. This is probably the most common though, where you have 4, and we do have a 5th category down there with the insufficient evidence. But there are multiple categories in order. They're qualitative descriptors relative to a standard. And so we're describing the achievement with advanced, proficient, approaching proficient, that kind of language, as opposed to A, B, or C. There's also enough categories to make sure we have distinctions between categories. But one of the things that's interesting is that as most of us probably grew up with that 100-point scale and going, okay, we've got anywhere from 0 to 100 is within that range, or the number of options that you have in terms of a scale, that the more categories you have, in that case it would be 100 categories, the more difficult it is to actually have reliability with grading between teachers. And so that's something that standards-based grading attempts to do, is to simplify that a little bit into a scale that's easier for us to be reliable within each other. One good analogy that Guskey uses is the GPS analogy. So the destination is the standard or the learning target. It's where we're trying to get to. It's that proficiency that we're trying to reach with that standard or learning target. The location is kind of the current performance. So that's what we're reporting out, say in parent view or synergy, to say this is what the student knows and is able to do at this time currently. And then the directions are the feedback given to students, saying, okay, this is where you're at right now. Here's the feedback I'm giving you so that you can change course or continue along the course that you're on and continue that growth. So kind of an interesting analogy, but kind of a nice way to look at it. This is an example of kind of what we're talking about, because the top line here, if you consider that being proficient on a standard, that's where we're trying to get. And you can see we've got 3 different lines, and if you think of those as 3 different students, they've all had a different path to getting to that top line. But everybody got there in the end, and that's what we're really focused on, is making sure that all of our students learn at high levels, and that we give them opportunities to do that, and that really this is equal. All 3 of these lines really become equal at the end, because that's the point that they reached, was proficiency. So the growth that they undertook on the way there is important to document, but the most important thing is, do we get there at the end? Do we reach proficiency? So that's something that we're focused on, and again, that's part of that concept around being standards-based. So Guskey says there's 3 elements for success. 1, we need to be clear on our purpose for grading and feedback. We also need to address the non-negotiables, which I'll show you here in just a minute for standard-based grading. And then he also talks about using professional judgment instead of mathematical algorithms or calculations to determine grades. So we're going to go through an exercise that illustrates that here in just a moment. So some non-negotiables in standard-based grading. Number one, multiple grades instead of hodgepodge grades. So hodgepodge grades, what he's referring to there, are things like kind of mixing in a lot of different factors into an overall grade. So again, when I was in school, what I experienced most times in classes was, we had a 100-point scale, an average of points based on, might be 20 points for this assignment, might be 40 for this one. Maybe the test was 100 points, kind of depended on the teacher and what their system was. And I also probably got some points for doing things like being on time in class, making sure I was turning in my homework on time, showing good behavior in class, participating, things that are important, things that we care about and we actually call work habits, which we'll show you here in a minute, but don't tell us much about my performance towards a standard, my actual achievement. And so the hodgepodge grade kind of mixes that all together into an average, which can make that hard to determine what does that grade really mean. Whereas as we're doing this, we separate that out to an achievement score, and then we also have a work habit score that will give feedback on some of those process type things. Rubric scores instead of percentages are number correct. So again, Wendy and Cecilia are going to talk a little bit about rubrics and how we use those here at Kinard, but using descriptions around this is what advanced is, this is what proficient means, this is what partially proficient means, and these are the things as students you need to do to show that you're proficient, advanced, or whatever on that scale. So using rubric scores instead of saying you need to get 18 out of 20 to get an A, we're being descriptive about what exactly you need to know and be able to do to reach advanced or proficient. And then learning criteria instead of sorting and ranking students. So the idea is that we want every kid, like we said, to reach that proficient level, and it's not about creating a bell curve or saying some students are just going to struggle, some students are going to do well. We want all of our kids to reach that goal of proficiency. So 3 types of grading criteria. So this is where we talk about product being the achievement, and that's what we are reporting out on in terms of the standards. Process being all those behaviors that enable learning, and I'm going to show you a big list of process type of things here in a minute. And then progress is around improvement or learning gains. So things like our MAP scores, where we have an actual growth score on students to determine where they were at the beginning of the year, at the end of the year. That's a whole different type of grading criteria. Process, if you take a look at this list, this is a list of 32 different process type skills or behaviors that, again, when we talk about the hodgepodge grade, these are the kind of things that sometimes get factored in. And with that 100-point scale, kind of that traditional way of grading that, again, I certainly experienced in school, a lot of these things were a part of the factor. And for me, I was really good at things like attitude and behavior and class attendance and all those things. So I did well enough in those areas that I could pretty much count on getting a B, whether or not I did well in those tests or not, because I knew I was going to do enough of these things to kind of pad that grade a little bit. Again, when we're talking about being standards-based and grading according to a standard, we're taking these things out of the mix. We're still going to report on them, or we're going to report on them in another way so that they're not mixed into the achievement grade, so we're not guessing on what that score means, bringing out those skills and reporting them in 2 different ways. Okay, so results from criterion-based or standards-based grading and feedback. Again, we want to accurately describe the student learning. We want people, as parents, as students, as educators, we want to know exactly what students know and are able to do, and we're describing that through this process. Students compete against the curriculum and not each other. So it's not about ranking and saying, somebody's going to be in this category and somebody's going to be here, or talking about that bell curve. We're competing against the curriculum and all trying to reach proficiency on each of those standards. It encourages student collaboration because we take some of that competition out of it and make it about everybody getting to that proficiency level. Now we're going to work together and support each other to get to that point. And then it also puts teachers and students on the same side to master learning goals or try and reach proficiency on learning targets and standards. So those are some of the benefits that have been found. So again, when we look at purpose, we think that grades need to be based on what students have learned and are able to do. We want to be able to describe that through the rubric, through the proficiency scale, and we also want to be able to describe the student's level of proficiency at this time. And so that's something that changes a little bit when you think about, again, that traditional model where it's been an averaging of points. It comes down to actually using a little bit more professional judgment to say, as a teacher, I've gathered this much evidence from formative assessments all the way up to maybe a summative or a summary score in some cases, and I'm using my professional judgment or my professional analysis of the data that I have to determine a score that accurately describes what the student knows and is able to do at this time. And so when we talk about professional judgment, or when Gusky talks about it here, he says informed professional judgment can be better than mathematical algorithms. He says that teachers are thoughtful and informed professionals, which is certainly the case, here in Poudre School District. And they say, trust your mind instead of your machine. And so, again, we're going to do a little activity here that shows this, but keep in mind that teachers, every time a grade is given, that's always professional judgment, right? Now, when we're averaging those together, we're averaging all those professional judgments together to come up with a score. And what we're talking about is doing something that's a little bit bigger picture and saying, let's look at the whole body of evidence and say, okay, what best describes a student's level of proficiency at this time according to a standard or learning target. So now you've got a list of scores here. These are our students that we're looking at, and consider all of these scores here as formative assessments, okay? So when we say formative, it means that it's a part of the learning and growth process that kids are going through. We haven't hit a summative yet. We haven't done a summary score that says this is where kids landed at the end of that unit. We're learning and growing kind of through this process and providing feedback through the formative assessment process. But we're going to put those scores in. So when you look at this list of scores, you might see a trend. You might see something that tells you a little bit of a story about where each student is at. But what I'd like you to do right now is take a moment and look at each of these students. Take a look again at the trend. Keep in mind that it's chronological in order, and so these are the latest scores in terms of, again, describing the student's level of proficiency at this time. And think about what score you would give each student in terms of a summative score. So you're looking at that evidence, and you're going to give each student a summative score based on what you're seeing here with their formatives, okay? There. See how accurate, how reliable we are as a group? Okay, so if you're looking at Jesse here at the top, just put your, just with your fingers, put up a 4, 3, 2, or 1 and say what best describes, his level of proficiency at this time right now if you were to give a summative score. Okay, so I've got 4s, maybe a 3 here or there. I'm seeing mostly 4s. Okay, mostly 4s. So we'll put a 4 in there. Okay. How about Chris? Looking at Chris's formative assessments. Okay, pretty much, I think we're almost unanimous 3s. Okay. Okay, how about Aaron? Got 3s, 4s. Pretty close, maybe a little more 4, but we'll say here because we're somewhat split. Okay. How about Sophia? Can't see the name there, but it's Sophia. A little bit trickier. Got 2s, got a 1. I think probably more 2s than any number. Okay. And then how about Hal? This is Hal Kinard now, so keep that in mind. Okay. Looks like pretty much all 4s. Okay. So again, this was just looking at those scores, those formative assessments, looking at the group here, pretty reliable in terms of where we're at. Now, there'd be more to each story, right? You'd have more evidence if you actually knew the students and you'd seen the work. But even just looking at those scores, our professional judgment is pretty darn close. Probably the only one that we were a little bit in a little bit disagreement was on Aaron here. So when you look at now this is what happens generally across the country when these scores are put out, almost the same. This is the only one we were a little bit off on, or we had 3s and 4s, and this one comes out kind of a mix between 2 and 3. But again, across the country, this is what groups like this will say when we do this work. Now compare that to some of the calculation methods, right? We've got mean, which would be an averaging of all those points together. We've got median, which would be the middle score on all those points. We've got mode, which would be the most common score coming up. And then we have trend, which is actually something that we were kind of using last year's power law, if you remember that one. And it's where it gives a little more weight to the scores that are later in the process. It's still an average, but there's a little more weight to the more recent scores than the ones that were further away. So when you look at that, again, there's some things to notice, right? And we're kind of all over the map. But when we looked at, again, describing what a student knows and is able to do at this time, oftentimes what we're doing is we're giving students credit for what they really know at that point, and we're not penalizing them for this period of growth that they were under early in the formative assessment process. One of the disadvantages of averaging points is that you start to dig that hole as you struggle early, and it gets hard to find your way out of it because the average builds up. And so when we look at the professional judgment or professional analysis, it allows us to accurately describe what students know and are able to do right now based on that evidence. Okay? So kind of a fun exercise.
About feedback. That is that heart of the relationship between the student and the teacher. It's that back and forth interaction where the students are going to receive information about how their progress is happening. And at Kinard, we like to do this in a lot of ways. And the kids have given us some feedback on how we give feedback, the things that work well for them. I'll highlight one in particular that I like to use in social studies is Socrative.com. And the kids might come in and they know if there's a note on the board that says time to get laptops out, they might be doing a pre-test. Recently we did one on what was their background knowledge they had on Democrats versus Republicans in terms of their platforms and history. And so they went through a simple online pre-test and they get immediate feedback of how much knowledge they have. Some had 40%, some had 60%, but as a teacher in real time, I can see them answering on the screen, and at the bottom I'm getting totals, so I know as a class, only 42% of us really understand this right now about Democrats and Republicans. I put that up on the smart board, we look at that, and we take time to clarify that, then we go into an activity and some student-centered learning, and at the end of the class they come back, they do that same post-test again, except this time we made it more fun. We did it as a space race, and they worked with a partner and they put their names in, and it's not just accuracy, but it's speed this time too. And so they have a lot of fun with that kind of feedback. It's timely, it's creative, it increases engagement, it increases overall student knowledge and skills, and it's fun. So just wanted to share that piece, and you might see here things we do, everything from a human barometer, tickets out the door, one-to-one check-ins, posting comments in Google Docs, posting comments in Student View, peer editing, Vistify. So there's over 20 different types of feedback here in addition to actual grades that they see, and we use them on a daily basis.
Thank you. So the next part of this session is going to try to build a bridge between the standards-based grading philosophy that we've been talking about and what you actually see in synergy. So when we say synergy, we call that student view, we call it parent views, so all of those terms are synonymous. So we're going to work on building that bridge. Before we do though, I want to point out that we say standards-based grading. What we mean is that we are using the standards to guide our work in planning instruction, in actually instructing students, in assessing, in giving feedback, in grading, one piece of all of that, and in reporting. So we say standards-based grading, but it really is about using the standards to guide our work in all of those areas. One of the ways that we tie all of those things together is through the use of rubrics. So standards help us define what we want students to know and be able to do, but the teacher-created rubrics really help us communicate that. So these are a little bit out of order, so let me skip over here. So with our rubrics, we're going to show you some examples of specific rubrics. We're going to talk a little bit about the general commonalities between them. But it's a tool that helps us plan instruction. It helps us to communicate to students what our expectations are. It helps us to describe for students what does it look like to be proficient, what would it look like to be advanced. It helps us to assess their understanding, because one of the places that students see rubrics consistently is at the beginning of every assessment. So the first page of every assessment, most assessments, is the rubric that tells them this is what we want you to know and be able to do. That it includes the standard. We describe the proficiency levels, and then there's the assessment that falls in line with that. So all of those things are in alignment, and it's part of how we provide feedback to students on their learning. So let's look a little bit at the rubrics. Let's switch off of that. You have, I hope, gotten 2 handouts. I'm going to be referring to this one that says, So before we look at
an
actual rubrics, does anyone need one of those handouts? Let's talk a little bit about the proficiency levels. And Jesse talked about this a little bit in terms of general philosophy, but in the middle of this first page, this is the kind of the general proficiency levels that we use. So you'll notice the first score is the proficiency score. So if you can pay attention to the numbers, I'm going to comment on the numbers there in just a little bit. The academic achievement, the descriptor of it, so the advanced, the proficient, partially proficient, and then the descriptors. So when we're talking to students about what our expectations are, what we want them to learn, we try to speak in this language. So we talk about what would it be, what would it look like to be proficient. So based on the standards, we tell them what the standards are and what we're looking for. If they meet the course level expectations, the course level, the grade level standards, that would be considered proficient. To go above that to the advanced level, we're looking at more in-depth understanding, that they're exceeding course level expectations, and they're doing it at a really high level of quality and complexity. So that's what we would consider to be advanced. When we talk to students, we talk to them in that language. We talk about advanced and proficient. And we try to stay away from the, it's a 4 or it's a 3. Because the conversation is richer when we're talking about it as being, this is proficient work or this is advanced work. At the proficient level, again, that's the course, the grade level expectations. Approaching proficient would be, we also call it partially proficient, that they show some understanding of the standard, some ability to do what we're asking them to do, but they're not quite there yet. And then obviously we have some other descriptors in that rubric as well. These proficiency levels, again, we try to talk about them in terms of the language, the advanced, proficient, partially proficient, but we know that there's a tendency to try to put even letter grades to them. So we know there's a tendency for students to say, well, I got a 4 or I got a 3. We really try to use that advanced proficient language, and we're going to ask you if you would support us in that in your conversations with your students, because once we start putting a number or even a letter to it, there's a lot of symbolism that goes with that is harder to talk about with kids, because they know that we want them to have A's, but what does an A mean? So we really try to use those descriptors. You'll notice in this main scale that there is no A, B, C, or D, but we know that it's tempting to try to attach A, B, C, D to it. Have you done it? Most teachers have, most students have. So I'm going to try to steer us away from that. And then I'm going to go on to tell you that 66% of our 7th and 8th graders are currently enrolled in a high school credit-bearing course. So as a result of the need at the high school level to have a letter grade for transcripts and for GPA purposes, we have to translate our proficiency levels of advanced, proficient, partially proficient into letter grades. So to do that consistently across the district, all of the middle schools use this scale that's at the bottom. So if you take a peek at that, you might quickly notice that the numbers are not the same as the level above. So that's where if we really, you'll see on our rubrics where we describe what those proficiency levels are. If we can really try to stick with the wording, it is more clear to students. But again, we recognize that there's a difference between those two scales, and it's just important that we know that that difference exists because many of your students will, if they are not already in a high school course, they will have a high school course before they leave Kinard. From the proficiency levels to the actual rubrics, so on your next page of your document, there are a couple of actual rubrics. So the first one is from our algebra course. So I'm going to walk through this pretty quickly. We have two actual rubrics. One is an algebra math rubric, which is fairly general, and then Wendy's going to share a history rubric, which is a little bit more specific. So what I'd like you to notice is what they have in common, and then also recognize that different content areas can have different levels of complexity with them. So on the algebra rubric, you'll notice at the top that it says summative. So Jesse referred to this a little bit. We call quizzes formatives because students are forming their understanding. Teachers are forming their lesson plans for the next day. So if we give a formative and we say, ooh, that didn't go so well, maybe I hadn't taught that concept well enough, then I adjust the next day what I'm teaching. Students can adjust what they're doing if they're realizing, ooh, I didn't get that so well. So it's forming their understanding, so that's the formative piece of it. Then when we get to the end of a unit, we've given multiple formatives, we've given feedback in multiple ways. That's when we do the summative. So in kind of old-fashioned regular use, we call that a test, like a unit test. So this is actually the rubric from our first algebra summative. You'll notice at the top that it says grade level expectation. Pay attention to that because when we get to synergy, I'm going to show you how this lines up with what's in synergy. So that's the language from the standards that says what we're learning in this unit. And if you read it, you may say, well, that kind of makes sense to me, but not really. So then we translate that into kid-friendly language. So the learning targets that fall underneath that are the more kid-friendly, this is what we're doing each day. So when they come in, we have a learning target on the board, and the learning target may have been solve linear equations. So again, trying to translate that into the classroom. Right below that is the proficiency descriptors specific to math. So this year we have new curriculum, and as we're bridging into that new curriculum, we're using this, this kind of generic rubric that lines up with the general rubric we looked at before, but it emphasizes the difference in math between mistakes and misconceptions. So we know if we have a quiz that has 10 questions on it, that a student might miss 3 of them. But why they miss them is important. So if they miss them because they really have no idea how to solve a linear equation when there's variables on both sides, then that's a bigger deal than if they missed the problem because they accidentally said that 8 times 7 is 64. So we talk a lot with students in math about the difference between a mistake and a misconception. And the rubrics really reflect that. So to be advanced doesn't mean they have to be perfect. It means that they can make mistakes as long as they demonstrate that they know the skill and are able to do what the standard says. The proficient part of it is that they made some mistakes. Maybe they didn't communicate clearly. Maybe it's hard to tell sometimes what they were thinking or what their mistake was. But in general, there's no evidence that they didn't understand what we were looking for them to understand. And then partially proficient would be, there's obvious gaps in what they know and are able to do. So we have identified at that point what we need to work on going forward. So again, just an example of a rubric that's used within a math classroom. And now Wendy's going to talk a little bit more about a more detailed rubric that she uses in history.
So the second example that we're going to look at is the history rubric. Recently, we studied the Declaration of Independence as part of the Constitution unit in 8th grade. And this rubric is much more detailed for the purpose of students to be able to express specific skill ability and some depth of knowledge with the content. So if you would look at the top, please, of this rubric, you will see the Colorado standard there, and not so friendly for 8th grade understanding, so it has been worded into the student-friendly language. And then when the students receive this, just to give you some context, we take about 15 to 20 minutes to walk through this page together, to highlight it, to annotate it, to ask questions, get clarification on what specific parts are. So as the students and I were looking at this, and I have the document camera and I'm highlighting with them, we're pulling out the handouts that we used as homework when we were beginning to study the Declaration in the Common Language and compare that with the original primary source language. And it's really impressive to see your students be able to pull out primary source language from the 1700s and be able to then talk about the significance of it. Rubrics like this help them to achieve that high academic level. We go through the expectations as a reminder of the kind of quality that we're looking for in a project. And then we really dig in and we tear apart what the rubric means. What does it mean to be proficient advanced as a starting place with the Declaration of Independence? And we're highlighting that, okay, so in terms of required elements, if I'm making a poster or a Google slide, I've got it, there's 4 parts of the Declaration, I've got to include 4 parts right there, so we're highlighting that. That way, I'm demonstrating that I have a whole conceptual understanding of that. And then I've included some original primary source language on my poster. So what's the difference then? We say, I have them look and say, what's the difference? And they look at the verbiage there. Oh, okay, in 4, I'm not just explaining the parts, I'm analyzing. I'm going in deeper where I'm comparing this time where the students were studying the Declaration, they're comparing that time of the 1700s to maybe a student compared to what's happening in South Africa in the 1980s. And so they're going back and forth in their poster comparing the struggle there, or they're comparing some things where in the original text it's talking about how the grievances were there and the king was committing abuses, so they talk about today what would that look like and what would the laws be for that. So they're analyzing the significance. The second part of the rubric where they're going into the freedoms of it, this is the part of the standard that says I can explain how these democratic freedoms have continued to remain ideals, but they've changed over time. Things like all men are created equal. They're explaining what historical events have changed that now, so that what does equality look like in our Constitution. And if they're able to give multiple examples, that's really advanced in 8th grade to be able to do that. So again, having this kind of language and detail and working through it as a class enables them to be really ready and confident to begin. And they started in writing class, and it was just awesome to see how, you know, the fingers are flying and the Google slides, and they have fun with it. And I just feel like this opportunity for them to be able to do this is so much more meaningful than always just giving students a test and then putting that back. So it's another way to show their learning. Okay.
This is one of our students. So to log on to Synergy, there are links on Kinard's webpage. There's links on the PSD Schools webpage. So multiple ways to get in there. If you have not been in there and you don't have an activation key, our school registrar can help you with that. So that's Susan Clock. If you need to call her, you can call the main number and ask to be connected with her, and she can give you that activation key. But once you log in, this is what you're going to see when you first get in there. And there's a lot of, obviously, good information here. We're really going to focus just on this gradebook piece. I'm also just going to briefly comment on the report card. At the end of each quarter, there will be a report card in here. Right now, there is not. So when we finish the quarter and we kind of take this snapshot at the end of a point in time, the report card is a different way of looking at it. I think in today's world, with the technology that we have, the report cards are a little anticlimactic, because we have been entering things all along, and you've been seeing the progress, but there is that kind of line in the sand at the end of each quarter. So I'm going to go into Gradebook. So when you first come in here, you see your student schedule. I want to point out a couple things on this page, and then I'm going to spend most of the time within the math course. You'll notice that most of the scores over here are just the numbers. So in a course that is just a middle school course, it's going to have a number here, and then this is the average. So this is the rounded, and then this is the average. So the 3.4 is rounded to a 3, so it gives you a little bit more detail. And I just touched the screen, didn't I? But you'll notice that this student actually has 2 high school level courses, and so I chose one of our 8th graders so you could see what that looks like. The algebra class, you'll notice, has an A, so again, that's using that high school conversion chart. And then our world language classes, if it's 1B or, Jesse, you might help me with this, or 2,
Yep.
those are the credit-bearing world language classes. So that's something to notice on this page. Anywhere you click on here, other than the person's name, will bring you into the next level of detail. If you click on the teacher's name, it's going to pop open an email for you to email the teacher. So I'm going to go into this algebra class. This is the first screen that you get in here. So I'm going to ask you to look back at the rubric for just a minute, where I showed you at the top of it that grade level expectation. So the language that's at the top of that rubric is actually the language that shows right here. So you can tell on this summative that it's going to be in this area. So clicking anywhere on that language is going to give you all of the detail for that learning target. So this is really what we've been working on most of the year so far in algebra. It sorts in reverse chronological order with the most current on top. You'll see that I've got some little notes for my student to tell her, don't worry, you don't really have a missing assignment. Wendy, would you mind sitting at the, oh, I've got a keyboard right here, don't I? Can you help me? Never mind. So starting with, we had a formative on solving linear equations, so earned a 4, we've got the bars that also show us that visually. Then there was a summative, and you'll also notice that there's retakes in here. So this all becomes part of the body of evidence of whether this student is proficient or not on that learning target. The only things that count as part of that overall score are the things that say assessment. So if you see something that says practice or assignment, the teacher is trying to capture that information to communicate it, but it is not being calculated as part of a score. So it looks like there's a score here for an ungraded pretest. And a lot of times students do get 1s on pretest because we want to know what they already know, which is usually not very much. And then we do instruction and they look at how much progress they've made. So we like to show that to them, the growth that they're making, but we obviously don't want it to be part of a grade when there has been no instruction prior to that point. So again, practice and assignment are not going to count for anything. It's these assessments that are averaging to this overall mark for that learning target. So if I take the average of all of these, it's at 3.17 and it gets rounded to a 3. So when Jesse was looking at, when we were looking at those fictitious students, we said averaging doesn't make a lot of sense, right? But the system averages as we're collecting evidence. When we finish a learning target, that's when the teacher analysis comes in. So as I'm looking at this student and I'm thinking, they started off, you know, that some of that
The early ones.
yeah, the early ones are a little simpler. So I'm going to look at the student's score overall and I'm going to say the early ones were positive. You can see this bounciness, right? Because they're not all identical. They're all the same standard, but the first one was basic solving equations. The next one we had multiple variables. The next one we had distributive property and combining like terms. So each one is getting a little bit more difficult, culminating in this summative. So do we think that the kind of the end of the unit summative should count a little bit more? So in terms of my professional analysis of it, of course I'm going to look at this a little bit more carefully. But I'm also going to take into consideration, I gave them an opportunity for a retake on one of these learning targets because we hadn't had an opportunity to have a formative on that learning target. So I tell them that they'll always have more than one chance to demonstrate proficiency on a skill. So again, I know a lot about these assessments that don't show up in just the numbers, and I'm analyzing that. And when we're done with this learning target, with this grade level expectation, I'm actually can go in and override it. And one of the ways that you may see teachers doing that is that all of a sudden these assignments change, these assessments turn to practices. Because to turn it off from the calculation, we can change the category that it's in, or we can let it average, or we can override it. When we override it though, we lose some of the visibility about what's happening. So you may see summative scores in here, but you also might see what we're going to call a summary score. Where at the end of a learning unit, we're going to say, based on all of this evidence, just like we did with our 5 students up here, we think that this student has demonstrated at this point in time advanced learning. And so we would override at that point and put that 4 in there as their summary score. I'm going to click on that and collapse it again. This is the new one that we have just started. So we started to have some formatives in here on that learning target. But I want you to notice that these academic learning targets are on here, but so are the work habits. So the one that you're going to see probably the most activity in it is the one that's called I am productive. So we think homework is important for students to learn skills. But we also know that some students are doing it at school with their friends, some students are doing it at home with their parents, some students aren't doing it because they're going home to babysit their younger siblings. So there's a lot of things that influence homework completion. These scores are primarily completion scores unless the teacher has entered it under a GLE. So if it's entered up here, it's being graded for accuracy and proficiency. If it's entered under a work habit, it's a score based on that work habits rubric. So for me, in math, we have so many math homework assignments that I don't enter every single one of them. I enter a week at a time. So I have this week, the previous week. Sorry. You would think I would learn after the first time I did that. So I have all of the weeks in here. If your student has a missing assignment, this is the best place to look. So I used to tell my own students that I care about this, but I care more about this. I care that you're doing your work. I care that you're productive in class. I care that you're turning things in, because those are the work habits we're trying to instill in them. So for my students, for my own children, I would really emphasize these missings. So if you see that red missing in there, that's a great opportunity for a conversation with your student about this assignment is missing, what are you doing to communicate with your teacher and get that turned in? So just showing you that as an example. You'll also see that these say assessment. If we don't put assessment there for work habits, it doesn't calculate these bars, but these assessments under the work habits do not calculate as part of the overall class grade. So there's an overall class grade right here, and it is only made up of these academic achievement scores. It does not include these scores down here. And you'll also see some scores under the other work habits that are on that rubric. Again, some of those probably don't have quite as much detail in them, because we don't evaluate. We're always giving feedback on those, but we don't evaluate them as frequently. So that's a quick look at synergy.